Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Sustainable Change in a Traditional Environment. This is one of our webinars in our series of the Greenhouse 2.0 initiative, Cultural Transformation. I am Susan Ryan. I'm the Senior Director for the Greenhouse Project and really delighted for today's session. But before I introduce today's speakers, I just have some quick housekeeping details. You are in listen-only mode, but you are able to share questions or comments through the chat box, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And I wanted to let you know that at the end of this session, we will be able to take your questions. So as our presenters today are speaking, I want to make sure that you really, those questions that you have, that you save them, you put them into that chat box so that we can address them at the end of the session, and we will save time for that. So today's speaker, I'm going to introduce Audrey Weiner, Dr. Audrey Weiner first. And I first met Audrey probably over 10 years ago, and I thought she had one of the most ambitious goals ever, and that was really to bring the greenhouse model into the Upper West Side of Manhattan, a rather ambitious goal. And what impressed me most about Audrey was her incredible persistence and passion to make this project work. And Audrey, I'd say we learned a lot in that process. Audrey, at the time, was the CEO for the New Jewish Home. She has since retired from there. But I tell you, we did learn a lot in her tenure. But in addition to her role as CEO, Audrey played many other roles, including the board chair for Leading Age, the national. She has won numerous other honors and awards, and she was a founding editor of the Journal of Social Work and Long-Term Care. And with Dr. Judah Ronch, she edited 3 texts on culture change in long-term care. And I have to tell you, as I did my graduate program at UMBC Aging, and I'm sitting here with 3 of my colleagues who also did the graduate degree. We used that book quite a bit and referenced it. So, Audrey, we are grateful for your contributions and grateful that you are one of our speakers today. And secondly, I want to introduce Sandra Monday. Sandra is the administrator of Sarah Newman, the Westchester division of the New Jewish Home. I met Sandra a few years ago when she had assumed her position there. And as a licensed social worker, as well as the licensed nursing home administrator, I really appreciated that combination of social work and administrator. And over the years, Sandra, I've really appreciated your continuing passion to really ensure that elders are living quality of life experiences, and for you to really pick up the vision of deep, sustainable change in the environment at Sarah Newman. I love the journey that the New Jewish Home has undergone over the years, and I'm really excited to feature specifically what occurred in the Sarah Newman community of the New Jewish Home. So with that, I'm going to get out of the way and turn it over to you first, Audrey, to talk a little bit about your experience and your journey.
Well, thank you, Susan, for that lovely introduction, and Meg for helping us to put this together, and of course to Sandra, who is my partner in this, and to everybody who's on the line. If we can go to the first slide, it will just provide an overview of what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to look at what the clinical quality of life, satisfaction, and economic indicators were for the implementation of what we can actually call Greenhouse 2.0, but the creation of 5 small houses on the Sarah Newman campus, which is a suburban, standalone, not-for-profit SNF, part of the New Jewish Home. We'll have an opportunity to talk about what the successes and challenges were of operating these 5 small houses on a legacy campus. And all of that is part of what Greenhouse 2.0 has created as its vision right now in terms of expanding its footprint and its impact across the nation, and I might say internationally. As the retired CEO, I'm going to provide the context and discuss some early research, and Sandra's going to actually present the operations. So first, a word about who the New Jewish Home is. And you'll see that we were founded in 1848, operate on 3 campuses within the greater New York metropolitan area with a budget of almost $200 million and serve about 9,500, mostly elders, a year. The workforce is more than 2,200 staff, and they are represented by 4 unions, which has had its own complexity in terms of the Shabazim job description. And presently, there are more than 800 skilled nursing and rehab beds, as well as an array of community services. You'll see from the next slide that the clients who are served are really representative of the mosaic of the greater New York metropolitan area, both in terms of ethnic and religious background, as well as gender, with 2/3 of them being female. Important to understand what the historical context was of creating these small houses on the Sarah Newman campus. In the early 2000s, the New Jewish Home attempted to change the culture of what was then an organization that had 1,600 skilled nursing beds, and it was 3 campuses with nursing homes. What became abundantly clear was that to implement a program of culture change without deep organizational change was futile. And we've written a number of articles on that subject to save others the challenges that we ran into. Both management and the board, however, remain deeply committed to changing how the nursing homes operated and how the elders and staff and family members experienced life in the nursing home. And the board agreed, based on management's recommendation, that when the Manhattan nursing home was rebuilt, that it would be rebuilt using the greenhouse model. That said, and given the fact that it was going to be a number of years from the time of that decision to the time that something was actually rebuilt, there was also a decision to look first at the Sarah Newman campus and to think through with the Greenhouse Project how the greenhouse values and training and operating model could be implemented in Westchester, this suburb of New York. Consideration was given at that point to actually building several freestanding greenhouses on this suburban campus. But when the architectural design came in and the cost estimates at $7 million per greenhouse, because of the water conditions on that campus, it was abundantly clear that that was not a good expenditure of funds. And with the Greenhouse Project, we thought through how we could create something that would embody all of the greenhouse values, would take advantage of all of the greenhouse training, and would operate as if they were greenhouses. And because the Greenhouse Project was prepared to work with Sarah Newman as a legacy provider, we've been able to both do the implementation and understand the impacts of using renovated, not perfect buildings, but all of the standards of the Greenhouse Project. If we look at the next slide, you'll see that this is really consistent with the Greenhouse 2.0 initiative, which is focused on small house design, person-directed, relationship-rich living, and leading-edge dementia care. And in essence, the greenhouse wants to expand the footprint and make it possible for those who want to take substantial, albeit smaller steps toward true culture change. So the next slide looks at what the transformation project was. And in fact, rather than $14 million for 2 houses, this was a total of $17 million in renovation costs for 5 houses, still a very substantial amount of money. There are 3 long-term houses and 2 post-acute houses, and there's a variety and combination of private and semi-private rooms, recognizing that each of the semi-private rooms still has a private shower and bathroom. The next slide will give you a sense of the timeline for making this happen. Beginning in April of 14, when the first small house opened as a long-term care house, and ending just a few months ago in July when Small House 5 was opened as a post-acute house. The timeline really reflected the fact that we were not adding buildings, we were not adding any kind of structure, but rather this was like the Rubik's Cube of long-term care and post-acute facilities, because in order to create a small house, renovation needed to be done, elders needed to be moved in, and then the next renovation was done, elders were moved in. We never really, after the first house, had swing space, and hence it took a period of 5 years. Let me turn this over now to Sandra, who's going to talk about the project costs and the operation of this in much greater detail.
Thank you very much, Audrey. So this slide really reflects a little bit more detail, as Audrey mentioned earlier, about the costs of the building of these 5 houses. So the total cost came in at a little under $17 million. But what's interesting and is related to the fact that this was, not an external build, but a build that was in our current footprint, is that per square foot, that comes out to about $236. And when we compare that to the average greenhouse cost per square foot, as well as average skilled nursing facility, it is quite interesting that it comes in under the cost per square foot of those 2 external bills. So we thought that was something that was quite interesting. The next slide really gets into the details about why we decided to operate the final 2 small houses, what's now known as Weinberg Gardens, but we also refer to them as small houses 4 and 5, as a post-acute unit, as opposed to the first 3 small houses, which continue to operate as long-term care. As many of us know, the healthcare industry is changing rapidly, and one of the things that we noticed and took interest in was our Medicare revenue, and our Medicare rate was growing substantially over the years since we started the first operations of the small houses. And that we knew was a reflection of the acuity that I believe many of us are seeing in post-acute care and in the skilled nursing facility world, that we are taking care of elders with much higher acuity. That, combined with some of the challenges that we experience with long-term care, which we're going to talk about in future slides, regarding the competition for private pay revenue. So we looked at all of the different opportunities, and we really felt that the post-acute world was something that we wanted to delve a little bit further into. At the time, we were operating one 36-bed post-acute unit, not a small house, a traditional post-acute unit. And compared to the competition in our area here, that was relatively small. Most of our competitors had over 50 post-acute beds. So the combination of all those variables led us to the decision to stick our toes into the water of post-acute small house, which we started in 2018, in May of 2018. Next slide, please. So this is interesting as it talks a little bit more about the revenue per day versus the expense per day. And what we've come to understand from our personal experience, we've done an analysis, a recent analysis in 2019 of expense per elder per day based on various units within our facility. The long-term small houses, which, as mentioned earlier, we have 3 small houses with 13 elders, totaling 39. The expense comes out to approximately $452 per day. We have a combination of private and shared rooms, and the private room private pay rate is $545 per day, and the shared room private pay rate is $485. We also included our Medicaid rate because we do have a percentage of elders that live in our long-term small houses that have converted to Medicaid as they continue to live here and spend down their private pay resources. So looking at that, you can see that Medicaid obviously comes in at a loss for us, whereas shared rooms comes in at pretty much a break even, and private pay, private rooms, does give us a little bit of room for profit. When you compare that to the small house experience, which is the same rates for the private and shared room on a private pay basis, but the Medicare rate at the time that we ran this analysis, it was $676 per day. We're actually running a little bit higher than that now. But even at $676, compared to an expense per elder per day in the small house post-acute of $541, that's a significant amount of revenue that we're able to realize. And we will show you in the slides coming about where our payer mix stands within the long-term and post-acute small houses. So in this slide, we get into the detail, as I just mentioned, about payer mix. And what I want to bring to everybody's attention is really the last 2 columns. If you look at our long-term small houses, we have a pretty solid occupancy at almost 100% most of the time. But you will see that it varies in payer mix between Medicaid, Medicaid managed care, and private pay. The private pay at 42% is still a significant private pay margin, and similar to the Greenhouse Project mean of 47.8%, and significantly higher than the average nursing home, which is 8.7%. However, if you look at the Sarah Newman Small House post-acute, which occupancy is also running at 100%, you'll notice that the Medicare payer mix at 58.8% is significantly higher than all of the other areas. And as mentioned in the previous slide, also the highest rates. We also have a Medicare managed care payer mix of almost 24%. And we also do see some private pay revenue in the post-acute small house at almost 12%. So based on this payer mix, combined with the rates that we've shared, we are really seeing that the Sarah Newman Small House Post-Acute is a revenue generator. This slide talks about our clinical outcomes for the small houses versus our legacy unit. The information in this slide relates specifically to the long-term small houses, as we have a lot of experience with care in those small houses as we've been running them since 2014. The data has consistently shown greater clinical outcomes, better clinical outcomes in our small houses versus our other long-term units. We have good outcomes in our long-term units, our legacy units as well. We do consistently run at 5 stars in the quality measure ratings. But we wanted to just point out a few areas that we thought were interesting. So the first one is behavior, where you see that in our small houses we're at 3% versus 9% in our long-term units and 16% nationally. And that's related very much to the idea of having a small setting with very intimate caregiving, and this idea in the Greenhouse values of deep knowing and being able to really get to know what triggers the elders, what are some of the things that soothe the elders, and the caregivers are very much able to minimize behaviors in that setting. The same for depression at 3% versus 13% in our long-term units. It's the same idea of the deep knowing of the caregiving and being able to really address, and also the idea that there's convivium, there's a tremendous amount of family involvement in our small houses. We have families that visit, and not just the traditional say hi to mom, pop in, give a kiss. They sit at our table, they sit with our caregivers, they're there for hours at a time, and we really do feel that has a direct impact on depression. Regarding weight loss, you'll see we also have better statistics in our small houses, and I think we can all know that that's related directly to the fact that we have freshly home-cooked meals much 24 hours a day at anybody's leisure. So we do feel that that directly impacts reducing weight loss. We do not use any supplements in our small houses. Unfortunately, we do use them sometimes in the legacy, but because we have a kitchen and we know that we can whip up a milkshake or a bowl of ice cream or anything that they want at any time of day, we've able to completely eliminate the use of supplements and still keep our weight loss statistics down. And finally, UTI is at 0%, and we feel that that has a lot to do with the idea that the caregivers can really identify symptoms very early because of the intimate setting, because of the deep knowing. They have their eyes on the elders in a much smaller setting than it is on these traditional long-term units, so they're able to report changes much more rapidly and reduce the persistence of UTI. So the next slide talks about turnover, and you'll see from our statistics that we have a very good turnover rate in our small houses. We have almost ran at 0% for most of the years that we've been operating. In 2018, we saw a small increase to 7.32, but that turnover is related to a decision that we have made to make changes. I can tell you that 0% of the staff have requested to return back to the legacy since we opened the small houses in 2014. And the feedback we get consistently is that the worst day in the small house is still better than the best day in the legacy. And it's not to say that our legacy isn't a wonderful place to work, but there is tremendous satisfaction from our caregivers in the small houses. This slide just gives a breakdown in detail as to how we staff our small houses. The post-acute small house, which is the column all the way to the right, is adjusted sometimes even daily based on census and more importantly, acuity. So we don't often have 4 caregivers during the day. It's usually 3, but if we do have higher acuity, we will shift it to 4. The major difference for the post-acute small house as opposed to the long-term is there is more RN care on the post-acute, and we have a cook. Significantly, we've noticed that, and we just made a decision that the universal caregiver in the post-acute small house, it's very, very difficult for them because of the high level of acuity to provide care and take care of all the cooking. In our post-acute small house, which is very important to note, we have one kitchen that's shared between 2 houses. So we were able to map out a model of having a cook that prepares breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and the caregivers do serve and clean up, and they do a modicum of the dietary involvement, but we actually have a cook that's making the food, and that's actually worked out very, very well. The other difference is that we do have additional housekeeping services in our post-acute, again, related to the acuity and, more importantly, the rapid turnover. As our length of stay can run anywhere between 10 to 20 days, we do have to turn over the rooms more rapidly than we do in the long-term unit. So we did add some housekeeping services. But that's actually, believe it or not, turned out to be relatively cost neutral, even though there is some additional staffing, but we were able to do it in a way that it's relatively cost neutral. This slide really interestingly goes through all of the different areas that the greenhouse has pretty much turned upside down compared to the traditional nursing home model. So the first row in green talks about the greenhouse project model for all of these different areas, from decision making to dining to training. And the last column, or the last row rather, is the traditional nursing home. And you can really compare and see how different the two models are. But what's interesting is if you look at the middle two blue rows, it's interesting because even though we did not build a traditional greenhouse and we created this unique, what's now really a greenhouse 2.0 model, we've been able to keep almost all of the greenhouse model intact while operating non-traditional greenhouses. And it's really been a very interesting journey for us because what we've learned is that all of these things are absolutely integral to being able to really provide true person-directed care to the elders. The differences are really nominal. They are the fact that we don't have all private bedrooms. As Audrey mentioned earlier, we do have all ensuite bathrooms, and that seems to be the most important variable for people, more than the shared bedroom. It's that everybody at least has their own bathroom and shower. We have been able to maintain the dining exactly as the greenhouse model. The universal caregiver, as I mentioned earlier, in our post-acute small house, we do have additional cook services and some additional housekeeping. But the caregivers are still serving food, they're still doing activities. So in many ways, it really is a cross between nursing home and greenhouse. And I'd like to just mention too, from a training perspective, we still require all of the caregivers in all of our long-term and post-acute small houses to go through the greenhouse 5-day core training. And of course, those that are cooking also do the culinary course rather. So Audrey, I'll give it back to you, and you could talk a little bit about some of the research projects that we've done and been involved in.
Thank you. The first question that obviously came to mind for us, and I'm sure is in the minds of lots of folks who are on this call, is given that this wasn't a perfect greenhouse, to what degree was there fidelity as measured by the merit tool in all of the varying categories? And as you can see on this slide, the overall score for Sarah Newman in 17, which was the last time this was done, at 4.35, was higher than the composite of the other greenhouses. And if we then look at the subcategories, real home, meaningful life, empowered staff, and model support, you'll see that in each of these cases, the mean for Sarah Newman was indeed higher than the other responding organizations. So we concluded from that the model, which we're now calling Greenhouse 2.0, was indeed true to the values of the greenhouse project. And we think that that was true because of the training and because of the adherence to the values, even in the presence of the environmental features which weren't perfect greenhouse. If we go on to the next slide, you'll see an overview of some qualitative research that we did as a result of funding from the Donahue Foundation. Because, as I mentioned earlier, of the way in which elders moved into the small houses, that being that areas were renovated and then elders moved from the traditional nursing home into the small houses, we had an opportunity to actually ask the elders and the staff and the family members about what they thought the biggest differences were, and then how they attributed those differences to both the areas of food and meals and personal care. And you'll see that this issue of choice is the biggest difference for the elders between the traditional nursing home and the small houses where they were living. And similarly for the care partners and for the clinical service team, nursing, social work, therapeutic recreation, etc. You'll also see that this issue of relationships comes up for both the elders and the clinical service team, so that it's supported for us the areas of deep knowing and person-directed care in our jargon as being really critical from the perspective of the elders, the care partners, and the family members. If we could go on to slide 20, this is another way to look at the data. And this actually provides us with a sense of what was statistically significant in terms of the comparisons between the small house and the long-term care community. So I draw your attention particularly to the Shabazim talking about the difference in overall working, as Sandra mentioned earlier, the responsibilities that they have, which we know are different. The clinical support team members also emphasizing the overall working here. So to reiterate, the worst day in the small house is better than the best day of working in the legacy was supported in this qualitative research. Sandra?
Thank you. So we also have done a relatively small research study comparing the post-acute small house, actually one of the post-acute small houses, which at that time was 11 beds, compared to our traditional post-acute unit that we've been running for many, many years. And what was interesting is two findings. One is that a greater percentage of the small house patients or elders were reported to recommend us, very likely to recommend us to others versus our traditional post-acute unit. And a significantly higher proportion also had greater mobility off the unit, which is very interesting preliminary findings. And we are continuing to do further research now that we have the full post-acute small house open. With 20 beds, we really are interested to see where these findings continue to take us. So stay tuned on that. And finally, we want to talk about some potential questions for discussion, and continue things that we think need to be considered for those that are thinking about Greenhouse 2.0 and thinking about some of the things that we've experienced. So, of course, we wanted to look at what do consumers want, and these are clearly things that we've considered as we've made decisions about how do we want to move forward. What is currently available in the market? Looking at competition, for here in Westchester where we're located, one of the things that we've taken note of is that there's a very high percentage of assisted livings in our market that does compete with the private pay market here for us. Are consumers familiar with the greenhouse concept, and will they embrace it? What is the market depth for private pay long-term care nursing? And similarly, what is the opportunity and or demand for post-acute care when thinking about how you want to operate? It's wonderful that the greenhouse model allows for those two choices and perhaps others as well. How do you differentiate yourself in a competitive landscape? The question that we all face every day. How do you integrate the greenhouse concepts into the legacy communities? I will share with you that we've been very successful in doing that here at Sarah Newman, as we've required all of our employees, everybody from our medical records technician to our physicians and everybody in between, takes the greenhouse core training module. And that's something that's really had an impact on our legacy communities as well. What is the replicability of this model? And can this remain consistent with the philosophy, values, and practice of Greenhouse 2.0?
So with that, we want to turn this back over to Meg and Susan, who will moderate the questions, and we thank everybody for their attention.
So first of all, ladies, I just want to thank you for so well articulating kind of a powered by greenhouse concept. And a couple things while people are putting their questions in the box there. I think I always say, you know, it's what gets measured gets results. And your attention to really the metrics and how you will measure your success, the rigor by which you held yourselves accountable, I think is compelling. And I think the second thing that I want to mention is that it really is all about leadership. It's about leaders having a vision and not just having a vision, but really staying the course and persisting and to really making sure that teams receive the necessary education to support their success and to really the necessary to support to be successful in their jobs. So thank you for the questions that you posed and thank you for sharing your incredible results. So here's one question. Are your costs inclusive of the infrastructure improvement?
I'll answer that if okay. They are not. So the construction costs are separate. That's just our operational costs.
And I should add that in New York State, there is, as part of the Medicaid rate, some dollars toward depreciation. And the depreciation dollars are part of what was able to be used to do the work on the campus. And that work the capital dollars came from depreciation. It came from donations, individual and foundations, and it also came from a refinancing.
Great. So while we're waiting for other questions, I'm just curious, as you reflect back, was there a lesson learned, something that you might have done differently? I mean, I think you really shared, obviously, very compelling results, but is there something you might have done differently? That's the first question. And then I guess my second question, do you have a vision for doing more with the remaining beds in your legacy building?
Sandra, do you want to answer the second question first?
I was just going to say that. You know, we're still considering our options. We really are very pleased with the feedback that we've received on the post-acute unit. As it said earlier in the slide, we only opened the full unit, the 20-bed unit, in July of this year, so it's very early stages. But again, the initial feedback is extremely positive, and if we continue to see that we can actually generate, you know, more business, more interest, and still maintain the greenhouse values, I would think that that might be the direction we continue to go in. Again, having to take into consideration these issues that we have up currently about discussion as far as competitiveness and so forth. So we haven't made any final decisions. We want to continue to see how this post-acute experiment, for lack of a better word, for us, continues to show us results.
And I think if we reflect on what we might have done differently or what we learned early on, I think one of the issues has to do with the union. When we were exploring the greenhouse, there were only two other organizations in the country that were unionized. And we took a number of our staff who were members of the union to those facilities so that they could, in fact, get a sense of what the work was going to be. We negotiated a rate, which was an increase, I think, of 65 cents an hour. And I should say that the average hourly rate was about $16.65 an hour. And 65 cents was added on top of that. The challenge was twofold. One was, from management's perspective, the additional money was related to that piece of their job that they weren't doing before, in terms of self-managed work teams. The additional money was not related to the fact that they were doing light housekeeping or cooking, because those jobs paid exactly the same as the CNA jobs paid. And so it didn't matter at Sarah Newman or the New Jewish Home if you worked in the kitchen or you were a housekeeper or a CNA, your salary was exactly the same thing. So that becoming a universal worker and embracing those jobs meant you had greater variety, but you weren't doing anything which in our system was paid at a higher rate. What was paid at a higher rate, as I said, was the self-managed work teams. And that concept was not really understood and has haunted operations to this day. I think the second piece of opening the first unit was that, as excited as everybody was, union leadership said, you know what, we want to make sure that these jobs are okay. So we, all the leaders of the union at Sarah Newman, we're going to go work in Small House 1. There was much too much drama as a result of that. And over the years, we needed to even out the leadership so that there were leaders on all of the small houses. And it took a little pain to make that happen. And I think that both of those things were lessons that we learned and we're happy to share.
That's great, Audrey. A couple other questions. Were the initial residents transferred from the legacy building, or were the additional residents admitted from the outside community?
The initial residents were in the main transfers. None of this represented any new beds. So Sarah Newman was 300 beds and remained 300 beds. It was only when there was some really complicated renovation that we went down a few beds, but we never added beds. So that admissions from the outside were based on having actual vacancies in the overall nursing home, rather than admitting 13 new elders to those small houses.
And can you speak about hospice and palliative care and how it is integrated?
Sandra?
Sure. So the philosophy here at the New Jewish Home is really that palliative care is part of our framework. We do not use a palliative care consulting service. We have all of our physicians and clinical staff trained in palliative care, because our philosophy is that every elder that comes to live here in all of our settings is dealing with a chronic illness, as that's the nature of the people that we care for. So palliative care is pretty much provided to everybody, depending on the stage of their life, of course. So maybe early on palliative care, but as the condition deteriorates, we will then change our approach. That said, regarding hospice, we provide hospice in every setting we have here, including the small houses. So if hospice is needed, if our physician or some member of our team feels that hospice is appropriate, or the family requests hospice, we refer to one of our contracted hospice providers, and they provide hospice in all our settings, including the small houses. I will say, the loss of an elder in any of our units, our settings, our communities is really difficult, but it does impact the elders in the small houses to some extent, to much greater. And we're very, very considerate of the grieving process for all of the elders in the small house, the caregivers, the family members, because it's such a really intimate setting. And we're very considerate. We do not fill the bed, for lack of a better term, at least for 24 hours and sometimes even longer, in order for the staff to adjust and to give the family time to remove the items and so forth. But hospice is provided as well as palliative care in the small houses.
So another question, what are your ongoing estimates or expectations regarding staff turnover?
Well, it's interesting. So, for example, when we first opened the fourth small house, as a post-acute model, it was a little bit of an experiment. We weren't exactly sure which direction we were going to go, and we again dipped our toe in the water. And then when we saw that there was some really positive feedback and positive outcomes, we decided to make the entire unit 20 beds. And we had to go back to the caregivers and say, this isn't really going to be a traditional small house. We're going to run it a little bit differently than we do the other three small houses, as far as adding the cook, for example. And we gave, the caregivers at the time, we said to them, if you want to go work in the traditional small house, you can, or you can stay here. And they wanted to stay together. Not as a negative, implication of going into the long-term small house, but the camaraderie that was built between them over that 1 year period that they worked together in the first post-acute small house, they didn't want to leave each other. They really were a team, and their only concern was who's coming into this team, who is the cook going to be, who are the other caregivers going to be, because we want to make sure that they continue to be a team. That to me is a reflection of all of the training and all of the support that we give for the greenhouse values. And it's a reflection of they didn't want to leave even their own little community. So my expectation is that turnover will continue to be low, because even though it's challenging, and it's very, very challenging what the work that we all do, but they're much happier in these settings than they are in the legacy unit.
Okay, great. What is included in the $541.54 expense per day for the post-acute small house?
So it includes everything from food service, pharmacy, housekeeping, all of our purchase services, everything A to Z, equipment, everything that you would see on any, any nursing home report, if anybody's ever had access to that, in caring for somebody. So everything. The only thing, again, not included is the construction cost, but as far as caregiving, it's and staffing, most importantly, which is the number one cost. So it's, we kind of delved out, and this was done by a pretty significant analysis, but pulled out, the various different staffing support from nursing, social work, recreation, even maintenance, housekeeping, even our ancillary services, so things like medical records and finance and, secretarial support. All of that we piecemealed out and allocated a percentage based on square footage for certain areas like engineering, and then other areas based on the amount of elders on the unit.
And how long is your onboarding process for caregivers?
So we have, as mentioned, we require everybody to do the 5-day core greenhouse training. Depending on where they're assigned, if they're on the long-term small houses, they have to do all the additional lab practicum and culinary training. And then we have our own orientation. We have a 1-day organizational orientation that everybody's required to go. And then, of course, departmental, which can vary depending on what department they're in. So nursing has sometimes 1 to 2 weeks of orientation, depending on the position, and another department may have a 2-day orientation. So it's really
And go ahead. Do you use any outside vendors for training, or is it just the in-house training you just referenced?
We do primarily in-house training. We've sent a number of people to become educators, as Susan knows, but we have had a number of representatives from the Greenhouse Project to come and do training for us as well. But it's either, majority of it is done in-house, and then we do supplement with Greenhouse training. I do want to mention quickly, I think training is absolutely paramount to the success of this, to our successes. It's more than just orientation, 5-day core training. They're critical, but there has to be ongoing training. And the Greenhouse Project has amazing training modules, both virtually, through all the webinars, but also we've done a lot of retraining for both the clinical support team, all of the caregivers. We've done retreats with our caregivers where we pull them out of the house that they work in and do full-day retreats where they're able to get kind of refresher courses and also any of the areas that they're being challenged in. They've been really, really wonderful opportunities for people to just kind of relearn some of the things that they may have learned 4 or 5 years ago. So training and ongoing training is paramount to success.
Here's another one, and I can't echo what you've just said. I think you've shown us what's possible, but it does require a lot of intention. And I think I always say empowerment and really equipping care teams is a function of leadership, which really believes and buys into the idea that education is also a tool for empowerment, a condition for empowering people. So I appreciate you saying that. Here's one. Will private pay and Medicare revenue be enough to cover both the cost of operation and the capital investment? And how much free capital will be required?
You want to answer that, Audrey?
Well, let me answer a piece of it, which is to say that the capital probably broke down into 3 close to even parts. Of the $16+ million in terms of a third of it being from the refinancing, a third of it being from depreciation, and a third of it being from philanthropy. I think that the going forward cost of capital is going to really be a function of what Sarah Newman's management and board decides to do in terms of the remaining legacy units. And that's a big set of decisions that needs to be made. The per diem rate and whether it's enough to cover the entire organization is probably Sandra's big struggle on a daily basis. If the private pay percentage goes down anything, that's going to be an issue. If the proportion of Medicaid versus Medicaid managed or Medicare versus Medicare managed changes dramatically, that's going to be a challenge. And I think that everybody on the phone knows that there's very little margin in this work and that every single day there is a need to balance all of the payer mix. The one other thing that's important to note is that Sarah Newman was always full, right? So sometimes we see reports about organizations that have made a decision to become greenhouses that had an occupancy in somewhere in the 80%. Sarah Newman always was 98 and change, 99%, so that implementing the greenhouses wasn't going to change the occupancy. Implementing the greenhouses was done because it was the right thing to do. And the private pay percentages haven't gone up in the organization dramatically because of what's going on in assisted living and assisted living's presentation in the Westchester community as a place where people can live, and they can live until they die. And whether that's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do is a webinar that's much more than an hour long. But that has caused incredible competition. And the other thing is that it's not so unusual for someone to live at assisted living until they have no more resources, and then to choose to come to a nursing home. So it was a simple question with a very complicated answer.
As is the nature of our business, it would appear. This has been phenomenal. Thank you for sharing with us what's possible. I really appreciate everything that you've had to say. And, just a note to those that are listening today, we started this journey with you in 2012. And it was because of that vision that you really felt that more could be done. And you really challenged us to think beyond the confines of the straight up greenhouse home. And it's because of your thought leadership that really was kind of the impetus for the 2.0 initiative and what we are doing much more explicitly now. So we owe you both a debt of gratitude for the work that you've done. And I think the last point that I will make as I transition us over is that you talked about sustaining change. It wasn't just the implementation part, but it's, really taking and making the intention to sustain change. So thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Sandra, for this incredible presentation and for the incredible work that you do on the day in and day out. And with that, I'm going to just draw your attention to a couple of last slides. And one of those is an upcoming webinar on October 8th, continuing in the same vein of Greenhouse 2.0. We're going to talk to you about the Beverwick journey. And it was their journey to become small house to greenhouse. It's a pretty powerful journey experience. And once again, the outcomes are rather compelling. In addition to that, I wanted to make you aware of our workshop that will be held the beginning of October in Pompano Beach, Florida. October 2 and 3, on the first day, we're going to do an overview of the greenhouse model. You'll be able to visit the greenhouse homes at John Knox Village. In addition to that, you'll be able to visit their legacy building. And similar to the experience that Audrey and Sandra described today, they have done some renovation in their traditional nursing home, and they have really incorporated and brought those greenhouse core values, some of the architecture and design principles into that environment very recently. So you'll be able to visit the legacy building as well. And day 2 is a deeper dive into all of the things that would be important to know about how you can bring a greenhouse community to a greenhouse model to your community. And last but not least, please, these are the ways that we can stay connected via our YouTube channel, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. And for more information, go to our website, please. We've got a calendar that's always being updated. And with that, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. You will get a link of this recording sent out to you in the next day or two. Again, thank you, Audrey and Sandra. Really appreciate your partnership.
Our pleasure.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.